The world never truly stands still, even when it seems to be sleeping. If we wind the clock back to the beginning of the 20th century, we find humanity standing at a crossroads, both magnificent and fragile. It was an era when gas lamps were giving way to the bright glow of electric bulbs, when the hiss of steam engines was slowly being replaced by the roar of internal combustion, and when the sky, once the exclusive domain of birds, began to feel the first touch of man-made wings. An exuberant optimism filled the air, a firm belief that reason and science would lead us to a shining future free from suffering and limitation. Yet beneath the dazzling surface of progress, an undercurrent moved quietly, a faint tremor that only those sensitive to the breath of the times could feel. In quiet laboratories across Europe and America, far from the clamor of markets and the noise of politics, a small band of thinkers was gazing at something far smaller than dust, yet holding secrets larger than mountains. They were the physicists, the explorers of the microscopic world, trying to crack the code of the universe itself. For thousands of years, humanity had believed matter was solid, static, and unchanging. Now the curtain was slowly being pulled back. They were beginning to understand that inside every object, every drop of water, every breath of air, there existed a tiny universe vibrating with unimaginable energy. It was a discovery both beautiful and terrifying, a key that could unlock the gates of paradise or something far darker, depending on whose hand turned it. The years passed, and the mood of the world gradually shifted. The clear skies began to cloud over with uncertainty. Across the globe, tensions crept upward, creating distance between nations that had once been friends. The difficult time did not arrive with a sudden crash of thunder. It descended like a slow-moving fog, wrapping hope in unease. People began speaking in lower voices, scanning newspapers with furrowed brows, wondering where history was taking them. Amid this global uncertainty, the scientific community felt a different kind of weight. For them, the tension was not merely about borders or diplomacy. It was a race against time to grasp the hidden power of the atom. In the late 1930s, startling news spread quietly through scientific journals and private letters. Researchers in Germany had achieved what had once been thought impossible. They had split the nucleus of a uranium atom. This event, known as nuclear fission, was no ordinary laboratory experiment. It was proof that matter could be transformed into energy on a vast scale, exactly as predicted years earlier by Albert Einstein's famous equation. To the general public, it might have sounded abstract and irrelevant, but to physicists it rang like an alarm bell. They realized that if this energy could be controlled, it would become a source of power unlike anything humanity had ever known. The feeling was deeply mixed. There was pure awe at the grandeur of a universe that allowed something so small to contain the strength of the sun itself. But there was also profound dread. What if this knowledge fell into the wrong hands during these troubled times? What if, instead of lighting cities, it was used for purposes none of them wished to imagine? These questions haunted the scientists' sleep. They were people who had dedicated their lives to seeking truth, not to forging instruments of power. Yet history has its own way of pulling everyone into its vortex. Those who wanted only to understand how the stars worked now found themselves forced to consider the fate of human civilization on Earth and the United States. The atmosphere was still relatively calm compared to other parts of the world, but scientists who had fled the growing troubles in Europe carried their anxiety with them. They knew what was happening across the ocean. They knew the intellectual capacity of the colleagues left behind. An urgency took hold that words could not fully express, a drive to act before it was too late. This was not about personal ambition or the desire for fame. It was about preserving the balance of a world that was tilting dangerously. They felt like lighthouse keepers watching a great storm approach from afar, while the townspeople slept soundly. And so a new chapter in human history began, a period when the line between science and state grew blurred, a time when the calm of the laboratory had to share space with national strategy. This was the threshold of an age, a moment of transition when humanity's innocence began to fade, replaced by a burden of responsibility almost too heavy to bear. We are witnessing the start of a long journey that would change everything, not just the map of the world or the shape of politics, but the way we see ourselves as a species. Are we wise enough to manage the fire we have stolen from the gods? That question hung silently in the air, heavy and insistent, accompanying the first cautious steps toward the most secret and most ambitious project humanity had ever undertaken. And here, on this very threshold, our story truly begins. A story of human beings, of fear and hope, and of the struggle to grasp a power beyond imagination. The summer of 1939 should have been a season of peace. The sun shone warmly, a gentle breeze moved through the trees, and the waves along the Long Island shore rolled in with soothing rhythm. Yet for Leo Szilard, a brilliant physicist with vision that stretched far ahead, the calm of nature stood in sharp contrast to the storm raging inside his mind. Szilard was a restless man, someone whose thoughts always leapt 10 steps beyond everyone else's. He did not see the world as it was right now. He saw it as it might become in just a few short years. And what he saw in that vision kept him from sleeping soundly. The thought of atomic energy falling into hands hostile to freedom haunted him relentlessly. Szilard knew he could not carry this burden alone. He was only a scientist, no political office, no direct line to the centers of power. His voice would likely be swallowed by bureaucracy if he tried to speak by himself. He needed an ally, someone whose words carried undeniable weight, someone whose very name could make world leaders stop and listen. Only one name came to mind: Albert Einstein. At that moment, Einstein was enjoying a quiet retirement, far from the complications of academic life, spending his days sailing and reflecting in a simple cottage. He was a gentle symbol of genius, a grandfather figure to the world of science, revered by all. Szilard's journey to meet Einstein was not a casual social call. It was a trip driven by a quiet but urgent desperation. Together with his colleague Eugene Wigner, Szilard drove along empty country roads in search of the great physicist's retreat. There was a touch of irony in the scene. Two scientists, armed with nothing more than logic and a sheet of paper, on a mission to change the course of history. When they finally found Einstein, the meeting was anything but formal statecraft. It was a gathering of friends, sitting on a wooden porch in casual clothes, accompanied by the sound of crickets and the whisper of the wind. Yet when Szilard began explaining the uranium chain reaction, the immense energy that could be released, and the possibility that this technology was already being pursued elsewhere, Einstein's expression changed. The genius who had first written the equation linking mass and energy fell silent for a moment. He realized the practical implications of his own theory now becoming real. "I never thought of it that way," he murmured softly. It was a moment of raw honesty. Even the greatest mind of the century stood stunned by the consequences of nature's discovery. On that simple porch, beneath the shade of leafy trees, the draft of the letter began to take shape. The letter was addressed to the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Every word was chosen with the utmost care. There were no threats, no aggressive language, only a courteous yet firm warning, a notice that the world stood on the edge of profound change. It spoke of an extremely powerful new type of bomb that might soon be possible, and urged the government to pay serious attention to uranium supplies and to accelerate experimental research. It was a letter written in the ink of sincerity, an effort to protect the future rather than destroy it. Einstein added his signature, a signature that would become the key unlocking the gates to the Manhattan Project. Sending the letter, however, was only the first step in a long and winding process. It did not reach the president's desk immediately. It had to pass to the hands of Alexander Sachs, an economist and unofficial presidential advisor, who waited for the right moment to deliver it. The world was moving fast, the difficult times were growing ever more real, and the president's attention was pulled in many directions. Week after week went by, creating its own quiet tension for Szilard and his colleagues. Every day without a decision felt like a lost opportunity. They waited in silence, hoping their warning would not be buried beneath piles of state papers. At last the moment came. Sachs met with Roosevelt and read the heart of the scientist's concerns. The president, known for his sharp intuition, listened closely. He was no physicist, but he understood the language of power and risk. He grasped that if one side possessed this technology and the other did not, The balance of the world would collapse forever, with a single short sentence that would mark history. Roosevelt said, "Alex, what you're after is to see that they don't blow us up." The decision was made. A small committee was formed. Modest initial funding was allocated. At that point, no one would imagine that this simple decision would grow into an industrial giant involving tens of thousands of people and billions of dollars. It began merely as approval for further research, a faint green light. Yet for Szilard, Einstein, and the anxious scientific community, it was a small relief amid uncertainty. They had managed to sound the alarm. The call from the future had been answered. Though they did not yet know how heavy the road ahead would be, at least they knew they were no longer standing still. The great gears had begun to turn slowly, almost silently, transforming abstract ideas on blackboards into real plans that would soon absorb the full attention and energy of an entire nation. From a letter written on a summer house porch was born an initiative that would demand total dedication, the highest secrecy, and countless emotional sacrifices. The quest to unlock the secrets of the atom was no longer an academic discussion. It had become a sacred national mission. Once Albert Einstein's letter was received and the decision made to move forward, what had begun as a modest laboratory research effort rapidly grew into an undertaking without precedent in human history. It was no longer merely a scientific project. It had become a colossal gamble of logistics and engineering that demanded almost limitless resources from an entire nation. As global tensions rose ever higher, the need to move quickly became urgent. The task of organizing and executing the secret enterprise fell to General Leslie Groves, an engineer renowned for his extraordinary organizational skill and his iron determination to get things done. Groves faced a monumental challenge. He had to build gigantic factories to purify materials that were both extremely rare and extraordinarily difficult to process. Uranium and plutonium, before those materials could even be sent to the central laboratory for final development. The greatest difficulty of all was absolute secrecy. How could entire new cities be constructed, hundreds of thousands of workers employed, and unimaginable quantities of material consumed, all without arousing suspicion among the public or foreign spies? The answer lay in creating new worlds in remote, isolated locations far from population centers, places where secrecy could be enforced with ruthless efficiency. Thus were born the cities in the shadows, places that suddenly appeared on maps, swallowing quiet farmland and empty fields, and swiftly transforming into vast, hidden industrial complexes. Two sites emerged as the main production centers for the vital materials: Oak Ridge in Tennessee and Hanford in Washington. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became the clearest example of how speed and secrecy could be fused together. In an astonishingly short time, thousands of acres of empty land were turned into a secret metropolis. Workers streamed in from every corner of the country, drawn by the promise of steady jobs and good wages during the difficult years. They built factories so enormous that their true scale could only be grasped from the air or from closely guarded maps. Inside those plants, the workers operated around the clock in 3 shifts, running sophisticated machines that slowly, painstakingly separated uranium isotopes in a process that was complex, exhausting, and frustratingly slow. Most of the workers had no idea what they were actually producing. They only knew they were doing vital work for their country. Life in Oak Ridge felt like a strange blend of small-town community and tightly controlled military camp. The workers lived behind high fences under constant guard, yet inside they tried to create something resembling normal life. There were grocery stores, schools, movie theaters, and churches. Children played in the streets, unaware that their parents were part of the largest secret project in history. For many on the factory floor, their daily task was simply to press buttons, watch gauges, or move securely packaged materials from one place to another. If anyone asked what they were making, the approved answer was always something vague like electrical equipment or cleaning material. The irony was stark. Tens of thousands of people lived and worked side by side, yet they were all forced to exist in deliberate isolation from the truth, separated by walls built of carefully maintained ignorance. Meanwhile, at Hanford, Washington, the challenge was somewhat different. Here the focus was on producing plutonium, an entirely man-made element of immense potential. Hanford lay in a desert region where the Columbia River rushed past. The project required colossal amounts of water to cool the massive new nuclear reactors. Once again, small nearby towns had to be relocated and land acquired at lightning speed. Building the reactors themselves was a marvel of civil and industrial engineering. Massive structures of thick concrete designed to bombard uranium with neutrons and transmute it into plutonium through a complex irradiation process. The engineers, technicians, and construction workers at Hanford felt the crushing weight of their task. They labored under intense time pressure in a harsh, isolated environment. Yet in that remoteness, they forged deep friendships and a powerful sense of shared purpose. They knew they were part of something enormous, something that would alter the course of the global conflict, even if they could not see the final shape of that change. Pride and dedication were the dominant emotions. They were invisible cogs in a gigantic machine, each playing a critical role without ever seeing the whole mechanism. The emotional reality of life in these shadow cities is perhaps the most striking part of the story. Imagine living surrounded by thousands of people, yet being unable to discuss the details of your work even with your own spouse. Secrecy became a second skin. It created an atmosphere of constant quiet tension, but it also forged a unique community bond. They trusted and depended on one another in daily life, while guarding the same unspoken secret. This collective experience, this massive, tightly organized effort behind barbed wire fences, stands as a testament to humanity's ability to work together toward an ambitious goal, even when that goal is shrouded in profound mystery. They were the hidden foundation of the great journey ahead. If Oak Ridge and Hanford were the industrial heart and the production arteries of the effort, then Los Alamos in New Mexico was its brain. This was the place where all the material painstakingly processed in the shadow cities would finally arrive, and where the greatest minds on Earth would gather to solve the final puzzle. Los Alamos was not an industrial complex. It was a laboratory, or more accurately, a scientific village built atop a remote, high mesa that had once been nothing more than a quiet boys' ranch school and his relentless pursuit of secrecy. General Groves needed a site that was completely isolated, difficult to reach, and yet beautiful enough to persuade the world's leading scientists to leave the comfort of their universities. Los Alamos offered all of that. The breathtaking views of the Jemez Mountains and the vast high desert plateau provided a stunning backdrop, while guaranteeing profound seclusion. The official name of the effort was simply Project Y, and its existence was guarded even more tightly than Oak Ridge or Hanford. The intellectual leader of Los Alamos was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist of dazzling intelligence and refined taste in art and philosophy. Oppenheimer was a conductor of an orchestra made up of geniuses. He possessed the rare gift of uniting physicists, chemists, and mathematicians from wildly different backgrounds and temperaments, aligning them toward a single shared goal. The challenge at Los Alamos was purely intellectual: how to turn a theory of nuclear fission into a working, functional device. Life at Los Alamos felt far more like a university research community than a military installation. The crucial difference, however, was that here there was no freedom to travel, no secure telephone lines, and every incoming and outgoing letter was censored. The scientists and their families had to adapt to conditions that were makeshift at best. Houses were thrown up quickly, often lacking adequate heating or reliable water. This created a powerful sense of both physical and emotional isolation, yet at the same time it forged unbreakable community bonds. The scientists' wives, many of them highly educated themselves, though kept in the dark about exactly what their husbands were doing, worked hard to create a semblance of normal life in the middle of the desert. They organized dances, arranged schooling for the children, and shared stories and laughter to ease the tension everyone felt. It was a story of human resilience, how they built culture and friendship in a place deliberately designed to be secret and functional. Behind the laboratory walls, the energy and intensity were extraordinary. The scientists worked endless hours, driven by a sense of responsibility and a healthy intellectual rivalry. They argued fiercely at blackboards, scribbled complex equations, and designed components that had to function with absolute precision. The pressure was real, but the spirit of collaboration under Oppenheimer's charismatic leadership kept their fire burning. They were not merely assembling a machine. They were solving the most daunting cosmic puzzle imaginable. Los Alamos was where science met conscience. The scientists involved were deeply thoughtful human beings, and they could not ignore the ethical implications of their work. In the evenings, away from the laboratory lights, there were quiet conversations and whispered discussions about what would happen once the project succeeded. They understood that they were creating a tool that would change the world forever, and they were beginning to feel the historical weight that came with that knowledge. The sense of responsibility grew heavier as completion drew nearer. The experience on that quiet hill was a microcosm of humanity's broader journey, a quest for knowledge driven by both hope and fear, carried out in profound isolation, and ending with the realization that the discovery would bring irreversible change. They were the architects of a new era, and their hidden existence at Los Alamos, far from the eyes of the world, remains one of the most fascinating secrets of the project that reshaped the face of the Earth. Behind the high fences of Los Alamos, the great journey of the scientists was not only about secrecy or logistics. Above all, it was a pure intellectual struggle. They were face to face with the puzzle of matter, a scientific challenge that demanded solutions no one had ever imagined before. The men and women gathered on that quiet hill confronted the most fundamental question of all: how to turn elegant theory on paper into a mechanism that would work with perfect, absolute precision. At the heart of their work lay the mastery of two extraordinarily rare materials, uranium-235 and plutonium. Each presented its own unique, almost maddening set of difficulties. Uranium-235 was fiendishly hard to separate from its near-identical twin, uranium-238. The vast separation plants at Oak Ridge, described earlier, consumed staggering amount of energy, time, and infrastructure. The material that finally reached Los Alamos had to be almost perfectly pure because only U-235 atoms could sustain a chain reaction. It was painstaking work involving countless repetitions and ruthless quality checks, pushing both technology and human endurance to their limits. Plutonium, however, proved even more perplexing. It does not occur in significant quantities in nature. It had to be created artificially inside the Hanford reactors. When the first shipments arrived at Los Alamos, the scientists discovered, through a series of nerve-wracking experiments, that plutonium had an alarming tendency to undergo spontaneous fission at a far higher rate than anyone had predicted. That single discovery shattered the original weapon design they had been counting on. The setback was not the end. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in their intellectual battle. They now had to invent a completely different way to assemble material, and they had to do it far faster than the simple gun-type method they had developed for uranium. The answer they eventually found, almost miraculously, arrived that was the implosion method, a concept so radical it demanded genius-level innovation in both theory and engineering. Implosion required a spherical shell of specially shaped high-explosive charges, often likened to orange peels or a soccer ball pattern, that had to detonate simultaneously with microsecond precision, crushing the plutonium core into a supercritical mass. If even one charge fired a fraction of a second late, the entire device would fail. This was a moment when every scientific discipline had to work in perfect harmony. Theoretical physicists stood shoulder to shoulder with metallurgists and explosives experts. Designers borrowed ideas from optics to create explosive lenses that would focus the shockwave inward with flawless symmetry. For months, the laboratories of Los Alamos hummed with intense collaboration. Blackboards were covered in dense equations, and every hallway and corner became a space for passionate, constructive argument. Oppenheimer, in his role of conductor, made certain every voice was heard and every contribution valued. He managed the small conflicts that arose under crushing pressure and pushed the team through waves of frustration. Their emotions swung wildly, soaring hope at each breakthrough, crushing disappointment at every failed test. It was a mental and emotional marathon carried out beneath a suffocating blanket of secrecy. In the end, Solving the puzzle of matter stood as a towering testament to the human mind's ability to conquer what once seemed impossible. From an accidental discovery in Germany, through the exhausting purification in hidden cities, to the intricate formulation of the implosion design on this quiet hill, every step had been a leap forward driven by persistence, curiosity, and an unspoken sense of responsibility to finish what had been started amid the urgency of the difficult times. Now, with the equations complete and the final design approved, the scientist part of the task was nearly done. It was time to hand their blueprints over to the engineers and technicians to let paper become steel and explosive become reality, bringing them one decisive step closer to the moment of truth. Amid the thunderous roar of massive machines in Oak Ridge and the desolate silence of the desert in Los Alamos, there's a story that is often forgotten. The story of the everyday lives and emotional struggles of thousands of individuals who were not the famous scientists, but the technicians, clerks, security officers, and families who supported the entire journey of the Manhattan Project. While the physicists grapple with the riddles of matter, these people face human riddles. How to live a normal life in the most abnormal place, under a veil of secrecy so thick that it seeped into every personal interaction. For most workers, the main attraction was the promise of steady jobs and good pay during a time of global hardship. They came from all kinds of backgrounds and regions, transported to remote sites in Tennessee, Washington, and New Mexico. Upon arrival, they were greeted by towns built at breakneck speed, where the streets were still mud and the houses felt temporary. The construction of places like Oak Ridge was a logistical miracle that cared little for comfort. Houses stood in neat rows, often erected without permanent foundations, reflecting the transient nature of their entire existence there. Although these towns were fully functioning, with schools, stores, and movie theaters, they were always bounded by two fences, a tall physical fence that cut them off from the outside world, and an invisible fence of secrecy that restricted contact between people. The rule of compartmentalization, the strict separation of information, was the backbone of the project's security. Everyone only knew what they needed to know to do their own job. A welder might spend his days joining intricately designed pipes, yet have no idea what substance would eventually flow through them. A typist might type reports filled with technical terms without ever understanding what those terms meant. This created an atmosphere in which trust was everything, yet an honest question could feel like a threat. The emotional burden of that secrecy was the heaviest legacy of all. Imagine coming home every day carrying the exhausting, nerve-wracking details of your work in your head, yet forbidden to share even a single one with the person you love most. Conversations became full of evasions and vague answers. The wives in Los Alamos, many of them highly educated women accustomed to intellectual discussions with their husbands, suddenly faced an unavoidable silence. They knew their husbands were working on something enormous, something that would change the world, but they could neither participate in it nor even understand its weight. Living like this demanded extraordinary patience and emotional resilience. The women in these secret communities played a crucial role as anchors for their families. They had to create hope and normalcy in the midst of suffocating isolation. They formed social circles, organized dances, arranged religious activities, and built good schools for their children. It was a quiet, collective effort to defy the absurdity of their situation. In the middle of the New Mexico desert or the Tennessee forest, they were determined to ensure their children had a happy, structured childhood, as though the troubled outside world did not exist. In Los Alamos, the emotional dimension was especially unique. Because the community was relatively small and everyone was part of the same scientific endeavor, deep friendships formed quickly. They shared simple pleasures, enjoying the spectacular mountain views, holding picnics on open land, or reading in modest lodges. Yet behind the laughter and togetherness there always hung a shadow, the shadow of the unspoken secret. This created a culture that prized emotional intimacy, where psychological support had to be offered without ever using specific words about the work. Often, genuine concern and a calming presence were enough to ease the tension coiled inside a scientist who had just failed an experiment. For the workers in production plants at Oak Ridge and Hanford, the experience was somewhat different. Though they were not involved in formulating theories, they performed highly specific, repetitive physical tasks. They were the backbone of the project. They faced risks they did not fully understand, handling dangerous materials that were simply described as vital to the nation. Pride and patriotism were their main driving forces. They believed they were contributing to something momentous, that their sweat and hard work would help end the global conflict. That belief, even though based on incomplete information, fueled an extraordinary work ethic. The story of life behind those fences is the human heart of the Manhattan Project. It shows how ordinary human existence persisted even under extreme pressure and secrecy. It is a narrative of resilience and adaptability, of finding hope in the simplest daily routines. The inhabitants of these secret towns were unsung heroes whose sacrifices were not only a time and effort, but a freedom of information and emotional closeness. Their lives stand as lasting proof that behind every world-changing discovery, there are thousands of hearts struggling to preserve their own wholeness and that of their families, in an era that demanded everything from them. After years of intense intellectual struggle, repeated experiments, and logistical isolation, the Manhattan Project reached its inevitable point of convergence. All the material purified in the shadow cities, and all the designs drawn on the blackboards of Los Alamos had now come together into a single physical object they called a gadget. This was the pinnacle of the great journey, the moment when scientific theory would have to confront the harshest reality. The site chosen for this moment of truth was a Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico, a place whose very name, Journey of the Dead Man, symbolized the silence and remoteness that had defined the entire project. The preparations for the test, codenamed Trinity, were a symphony of precision and paranoia. The circle of secrecy was tightened to its absolute limit. Thousands of scientific instruments, from high-speed cameras to pressure sensors, were installed in precise geometric patterns across the desert. In those final days, technicians and scientists worked without rest, checking every cable connection, every gauge, every component to ensure perfection. They were not merely assembling a device. They were staging an event that would put the laws of nature themselves on trial. The heavy military presence was there not only for security, but as an additional guarantee that order would be maintained amid unimaginable tension. For Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director, the days leading up to Trinity were the most personally grueling of the entire project. He carried the full psychological weight of what they had built. He had to balance scientific optimism with a deep, gnawing fear of the destructive power they were about to unleash. He grew quieter, often seen smoking and staring at the desert horizon, his mind filled with probability calculations and ethical consequences. That tension rippled through the entire team. They had all invested years of time, energy, and hope. Now they had to wait while fate was decided by the push of a single button. One of the greatest challenges facing the team was the complete uncertainty of the outcome. Although theoretical calculations predicted an enormous release of energy, no one had ever witnessed a controlled, full-scale nuclear chain reaction. There were fears on all sides. Some worried the gadget would fail completely, wasting vast resources and extinguishing hope of ending the global war swiftly. Others, including several senior scientists, feared the chain reaction might not stop, potentially igniting the atmosphere itself. Even though exhaustive physics calculations had largely dispelled that extreme possibility, this contradiction between hope and dread created a unique atmosphere. They worked at breakneck speed while being eaten away by profound doubt. As the critical hours approached, on the night of July 15, 1945, the Jornada del Muerto was enveloped in unexpected natural drama, a violent thunderstorm. Torrential rain and flashes of lightning added a new layer of anxiety. The small but real risk of lightning striking the steel tower holding the gadget could not be ignored. The storm force delay compelled the scientists and military officers to wait even longer, piling yet more strain onto tension that had already built for years. They huddled in isolated observation bunkers, some as far as tens of kilometers from ground zero, listening to the roar of nature clashing with the relentless ticking of the clock. That waiting became a space for private reflection. Inside the bunkers, Many try to distract themselves with light conversation, or even bets on the test's outcome. Yet, deep down, every one of them knew they stood on the threshold of monumental change. They thought of their families back in Los Alamos, their colleagues in Oak Ridge, and the global implications of what was about to happen. It was a suffocating silence, a collective moment when some of the greatest minds in the world felt powerless before the force they were about to release. Finally, the storm subsided. The sky began to calm, though scattered clouds remained. The decision was made to proceed. At 5:10 a.m., the final alarm sounded. Observers were instructed to lie face down, backs turned to the tower, eyes shielded behind pieces of welder's glass to protect their retinas from the possible blinding flash. They waited in absolute silence, accompanied only by the voice on the radio counting down each remaining second. That countdown measured not just time, but how far humanity had come. Each spoken number carried them closer to a new dawn, a dawn that would determine whether the Manhattan Project would stand as the greatest scientific triumph or the most devastating ethical warning in history. Those final seconds of waiting were the climax of tension for the entire project. They had done everything humanly and technically possible. Now they could only wait and see. They waited for the thunderous confirmation of success, or worse, the silence that would confirm failure. It was a destiny-altering pause, the moment when humankind surrendered the fate of its invention to the universe itself. They waited in reverent silence, knowing they were about to witness an irreversible, world-changing event. At exactly 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m., in the heart of the Jornada del Muerto desert, amid the suffocating silence that followed the final countdown, the long journey of the Manhattan Project reached its astonishing conclusion. All the science, toil, and hope of years crystallized in a single moment that surpassed every calculation. For those waiting in the hidden bunkers, the first sensation did not come through sound, but through the majesty of light. Even though their eyes were tightly shut and shielded by protective goggles, that light pierced every barrier, flooding the insides of their eyelids with an indescribable intensity. It was a pure white flash, brighter than 1,000 suns, brighter even than the sunrise rising in the east. Eyewitnesses later described it as a sudden enlightenment, a moment when both physical darkness and years of psychological tension instantly vanished. The sheer visual beauty of such an immense release of energy evoked awe, an instantaneous, profound shift in how they understood the potential of the universe. They had unlocked its deepest secret. After the blinding flash came the wave of heat, felt even from miles away, a warm caress that crept across the desert, reaching the observation posts and confirming that the experiment had succeeded. That touch was physical proof that their theory, the one that bound the tiniest particles of the atom into cosmic power, was true. This technical triumph, fought for through months of isolation and intellectual torment, should have unleashed euphoric cheers. Yet instead of jubilation, what followed was a deeper, more complex silence. For several long seconds, the desert was once again wrapped in suffocating stillness, and dramatic pause between light and sound. In that silence, the realization of what they had just created began to sink in. The scientists stood mute. Their minds were flooded with the knowledge that they had unleashed a force capable of altering the fate of human civilization. It was a swift moment of moral reflection in which scientific victory felt inextricably mixed with horror at consequences still unimaginable. Then, at last, the sound arrived. The delayed shock wave raced across the plain, shattering the silence with a prolonged, earth-shaking roar. It was not mere thunder. It was the universe proclaiming itself, announcing that a new era had begun. The rumble was profound and majestic, echoing off the surrounding mountains as though nature itself were acknowledging the monumental act humanity had just performed. When the observers were finally allowed to rise and look toward ground zero, they beheld the sight that would become the eternal symbol of the atomic age, a towering mass of cloud and dust slowly forming the gigantic mushroom shape. That cloud, swirling with colors from orange and red to purple beneath the dawn sky, was a breathtaking visualization of the power unleashed, a spectacle of awe-inspiring grandeur and solemn warning, J. Robert Oppenheimer's reaction in that instant perfectly mirrored the emotional complexity that enveloped everyone present. Rather than celebrate, he stood in reverent silence, his mind filled with philosophical contemplation. Quoting the Bhagavad Gita, he declared that he had become death, the destroyer of worlds. Those words laid bare the crushing moral burden now upon him. He had led his team to the greatest discovery in human history, yet one matched by an equal capacity for destruction. It was a painful acknowledgement of the eternal responsibility they now carried. Similar, quieter reactions were seen among the other scientists. They embraced and shook hands, but their cheers were subdued, overshadowed by the full recognition of the immense change they had wrought. They had achieved technical success, yet at the same moment they understood they had opened a door that might never again be closed. Trinity, with its dazzling light and earth-shattering roar, marked the end of the secret journey. It ended the long wait and the suffocating tension, yet it brought no peace. Instead, it ushered in a new and far greater ethical struggle. The scientists standing in that desert knew they had altered the destiny of the Earth. They had brought the power of the stars into human hands. That moment was both liberation and curse, a reality that demanded wisdom and self-restraint far beyond anything the world's leaders or its people had ever been asked to summon. The light in the desert was a turning point, a silent vow that bound its creator forever to the stewardship of the newborn power they had released. The light that flared in the New Mexico desert, though hidden from public eyes, could not be contained by secrecy. Even while the technical details remained locked away, the fundamental message that atomic energy was now in human hands traveled swiftly to the centers of world power. The success of the Trinity Test marked not only the end of the Manhattan Project's research and development phase, but the close of an entire, centuries-long chapter of civilization. It was a historic turning point announced not by political decree, but by the scientific manifestation of a wholly new force of nature. For those inside the Manhattan Project inner circle, Trinity's success carried a profound, double-edged impact. On one side, there was overwhelming relief. The exhausting, years-long journey of intellectual and logistical strain had finally reached its goal. The scientists and technicians had fulfilled the mission given to them. They had proven that human genius and perseverance could unlock the universe's deepest secret. They had completed the task driven by the hope of ending the world's terrible war. Yet, almost instantly, that relief was overshadowed by a heavy reality. The world they now inhabited was one in which unimaginable destructive power could be unleashed by a single decision. In the immediate aftermath of successful tests, the project's leaders, both military and scientific, were forced to confront the most difficult ethical question of all: how should this discovery be used? That moral dilemma could not be solved with equations or engineering diagrams. It struck at the very core of humanity and collective destiny. Many scientists who had originally been propelled by fear that an opposing ideology would acquire this power first now felt a new dread. How this force would forever alter the nature of global conflict and any hope of lasting peace. Their inner tension shifted from scientific pressure to an enduring moral burden. Within days, news of a new weapon reached the world's leaders, triggering a rapid series of decisions in the final stages of the war. The invention quickly became the decisive factor in bringing the long conflict to an abrupt end. Its use over 2 Japanese cities sent shockwaves around the globe and marked the sudden conclusion of the World War. Yet the end of that war gave birth to a subtler, more pervasive new anxiety, the dawn of a geopolitical era dominated by mutual fear and the possibility of self-annihilation. The fact that atomic energy now rested in human hands opened an entirely new chapter in history. A world once divided by conventional industrial and military strength was now divided by possession of nuclear knowledge. This shift demanded a complete rethinking of security, defense, and international relations. Scientists who wanted nothing more than to return to their laboratories in pursuit of pure scientific truth were suddenly thrust onto the global political stage. They became reluctant ambassadors of a new era, often unprepared and unwilling. They faced a public that largely did not understand the physics behind the transformation, yet was acutely aware of its consequences. They had explained how a force once thought to exist only inside stars could now be reproduced on Earth. The emotional impact was immense. For the broader American public, news of the miracle weapon that ended the war was met with an outpouring of relief and celebration. But for those who knew the full story, including the thousands at Oak Ridge and Hanford who finally understood what they had been producing, a far more complex feeling emerged. Joy at the success of their work mingled with deep sorrow over its global consequences. They had completed an arduous journey, only to inherit an extraordinarily heavy legacy. The world had suddenly become smaller, more interconnected, and fundamentally more vulnerable to itself. Many of the scientists involved, like Leo Szilard, felt crushed by the moral responsibility they now carried. They had stared into the abyss of atomic power and could never look away again. They began to speak out, urging international control of the discovery. To them, the bomb was a call for global cooperation, a warning that future conflicts could no longer be won militarily, only prevented through diplomacy and understanding. The hope that had originally driven them to end one war now transformed into a desperate hope to prevent all future wars. The change was felt at bureaucratic and organizational levels as well. The Manhattan Project, run by the military in total military isolation, now had to transition to civilian oversight. Fierce debates erupted over who should hold the keys to atomic power. Should it remain in military hands, or become the responsibility of a civilian commission committed to scientific ethics and the public good? These politically charged arguments reflected a larger national struggle over how to manage a force that redefined the very boundaries of state power. Scientists who had once concerned themselves only with neutrons and fission now found themselves speaking about legislation, oversight, and international treaties. Questions also arose about the fate of the workers and the secret communities. With the urgent need for secret production over, thousands of people from Oak Ridge and Hanford began returning to ordinary life, carrying with them the unique experience of isolation and world-altering labor. They were silent witnesses to the astonishing speed with which entire industries could be created and then dismantled. Their legacy was not wealth or fame, but a profound knowledge that they had been part of something far larger than themselves, a journey that changed the entire world. The new historical chapter opened by the Manhattan Project is complex and paradoxical. It is an era of unparalleled scientific progress, accompanied by a permanent existential threat. It demands wisdom, patience, and diplomacy on a scale never seen before. The scientists and leaders involved came to realize they had not merely ended a war. They had created a reality in which humankind must learn to live alongside its own capacity for self-destruction. That great transformation, which began with a flash of light in the desert, continues to shape every corner of global life to this day, compelling endless reflection on our responsibility for the knowledge we have gained. As the dust from the Trinity flash settled and the news of the wars and spread across the globe, a new, far quieter phase began for the architects of the Manhattan Project, a phase of introspection and reckoning. This was a time when scientific victory fell hollow without moral peace. For the seekers who had devoted years of their lives to unlocking the atom secret, they now realized they had reached the summit of knowledge, only to be saddled with an eternal burden of responsibility, a weight far heavier than any tension they had known during the project itself. Robert Oppenheimer, once the charismatic conductor of Los Alamos, now became the living symbol of that moral dilemma. His complex, melancholic figure perfectly mirrored the scientist forced out of the pure world theory into the arena of global politics and ethics. His private reflections, visible in his silent expressions and the philosophical quotes he shared, revealed a profound sense of responsibility. He no longer saw himself as an inventor, but as someone who had released a force of nature that now demanded accountability from all humankind. That burden of knowledge weighed on his soul and turned the rest of his life into a mission to educate and warn the world. He often contemplated the journey he had taken, from a theoretical physicist seeking elegant understanding of a universe to a man who had unwittingly created the most terrifying instrument in history. That contradiction became his lifelong personal torment, Oppenheimer was not alone in feeling crushed by the weight. Within the scientific community that had lived inside the secret project, a powerful wave of activism and ethical awareness emerged. Many scientists, especially those who had witnessed the Trinity Test firsthand or fully grasped the gadget's mechanism, felt compelled to act. Leo Szilard, the very man who had first urged Roosevelt to begin the research, now became one of the loudest voices calling for civilian and international control of atomic energy. For him, the task of ending the war was finished. The new, far more urgent task was to prevent catastrophe that could end civilization itself. He believed that, as scientists, they possessed a unique and obligatory perspective on the danger of annihilation. They understood that the original hope driving the project, preventing an opposing power from acquiring the weapon first, must now be redirected toward a hope of permanent peace. They argued that the only true defense against atomic force was political wisdom, international cooperation, and the shared recognition that humanity's fate was now inextricably linked. The isolation they felt in Los Alamos had turned into a moral isolation. They alone fully understood risks that politicians and the general public could not yet grasp. They felt like watchmen who must keep sounding the alarm. They fought hard against the military's desire to keep everything classified, convinced that knowledge this immense could not be locked away. This reflection took many forms. Some scientists gathered to create the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, whose mission was to provide unbiased information to the public and to governments. They labored to translate complex physics into language ordinary citizens could understand, stressing that in the atomic age there was no longer room for large-scale conflict. They urged that the power they had unleashed be used only for peaceful purposes, abundant energy, medical research, never as a bargaining chip in global politics. It was a new journey, from the laboratory to the public platform, requiring them to learn the foreign languages of diplomacy and public policy. The obstacles they faced were enormous. They had to battle bureaucracies determined to keep atomic assets under military control. They had to contend with the geopolitical tensions that arose almost immediately after the war, when nations, instead of embracing peace, began eyeing one another with suspicion. Yet in their reflection, these scientists discovered a new kind of power, the power to use their voices for the sake of humanity. They felt an ethical duty that went beyond their professional roles. They had stared into the abyss, and now they had to warn others what lay there. Deep within many of them lingered a longing to return to the days when science was a pure pursuit, free of deadly consequences. But they knew that time was gone forever. They were the generation that had to live with the reality they had created. This story of reflection is proof that science can never be separated from conscience. The Manhattan Project forced the world to acknowledge that every technological advance carries an equal moral consequence. These scientists, who once dealt only in elegant equations and experiments, now had to grapple with politics, ethics, and existential questions about the survival of the species. They left behind a legacy not only of discovery, but a repeated, urgent call for wisdom and self-restraint in the face of the power they had stolen from the heart of the universe. Their journey stands as an eternal lesson. The greatest knowledge brings the greatest responsibility, a burden they carry with dignity and grave caution for the rest of their lives. The Manhattan Project was a journey that began in absolute secrecy, and although it succeeded in closing one grim chapter of global history, it simultaneously drew back the curtain on an entirely new era filled with unprecedented tension. Its legacy reaches far beyond the piles of purified material or the intricate technical designs. Its true inheritance is a fundamental transformation in how humanity views itself, nature, and its own future. We can never return to a world in which atomic knowledge was merely academic theory. We now live in an age where atomic power is an inseparable part of global reality. One of the most significant legacies is a profound shift in the relationship between science and government. The project demonstrated that modern science, when funded and organized on a colossal scale, with virtually unlimited resources and centralized management, possesses the ability to alter geopolitical reality almost overnight. It created a new model in which scientific research and technological development became strategic national initiatives. This was the birth of what would later be called big science and the military-industrial complex. That pattern persists to this day, clearly visible in fields ranging from space exploration and clean energy research to the development of artificial intelligence. Scientists who once worked only in the ivory towers of universities now became principal advisors in the corridors of power, carrying with them the moral burden of their discoveries. They must continually wrestle with questions of ethics and isolation that arise when scientific truth becomes a state secret. Yet the weight of this legacy is often far heavier than public recognition suggests. For the scientists who witnessed the Trinity light, reflection on that legacy became a long and painful process. Many spent the rest of their lives not only continuing research, but advocating for peaceful control of the energy they had unleashed. They formed advocacy groups, wrote open letters, and delivered lectures to remind the world of the power now in human hands. They felt morally and ethically responsible for ensuring their discovery would not become a destroyer of civilization. It was a journey of redemption undertaken by the very inventors themselves, an effort to balance scientific achievement with human conscience. They realized that the hope that had driven them at the project's outset, preventing an opposing power from acquiring the technology first, must now be redirected toward the hope of permanent peace. They argue that the only genuine defense against atomic force is political wisdom, international cooperation, and the shared understanding that humanity's fate is now bound together. This viewpoint laid the foundation for decades of discussion on nuclear arms control and global efforts to prevent proliferation. The worldwide tensions of subsequent years, known as the Cold War era, were the direct embodiment of that transformation. The world became divided, yet paradoxically united by the same collective fear. The Manhattan Project legacy also permeated culture and society. The discovery influenced art, literature, and film, giving rise to entirely new genres driven by tension and apocalyptic possibility. Indirectly, it sparked an enormous wave of fundamental physics research. Facilities such as Oak Ridge, originally built for enrichment, were later repurposed into national research laboratories that continue to advance human understanding of matter and energy. The thousands of workers who had labored in isolation in the secret cities carried their skills and discipline back into civilian industry, transferring the know-how required to manage complex, large-scale technology. Their lives stand as proof that any project, no matter how vast, is ultimately built on the countless, collective perseverance of ordinary people. Thus, the story of the Manhattan Project serves as an enduring mirror for reflection. It reminds us that every great advance in knowledge carries an equal moral consequence. It poses questions that remain urgently relevant. How far are we permitted to go in pursuit of knowledge? And, more crucially, how do we ensure that the power we have stolen from the heart of the universe is used to elevate humanity rather than to destroy it? The reflections of the project's founders are its most precious legacy, an everlasting reminder that intelligence must be matched by wisdom. They gave us a complex gift, a force that demands we become better, more patient, and more responsible as a species. The project forever changed how we view energy medicine through radioactive isotopes, and even how we map the world. But above all, it altered global psychology, creating a permanent awareness of existential fragility. This journey has taught us that our responsibility does not end when the experiment is over. It truly begins at that moment. Their legacy is not merely a physical device, but an obligation passed to every succeeding generation, the duty to manage atomic power with the reverence and wisdom it deserves. The story of the Manhattan Project did not truly end on the morning of the Trinity Test, nor even when the urgent global conflict that gave it birth finally ceased. Instead, the story continues to unfold to this very day, woven inseparably into political, scientific, and ethical landscape we all inhabit. We live in different crises and tensions from those of the 1940s, yet we still dwell beneath the long shadow of the reality forged in secret laboratories and government offices. The epilogue of this great transformation is a simple, inescapable recognition. Knowledge is power, and power always demands accountability. The journey we have traced, from the first whispered scientific fears to the lifelong reflections of the discoverers, is a tale of ambition and consequence. It is a reminder that every turning point in history, ordinary human beings, with all their hopes, fears, and dilemmas, hold the fate of the world in their hands. We have seen scientists forced into the role of statesmen, engineers who built gigantic factories without knowing their purpose, and families who lived in isolation for the sake of an immense secret. All of them are threads in this intricate tapestry. The Manhattan Project is a profound case study of human potential. It revealed our capacity for extraordinary coordination, innovation, and dedication when driven by deep urgency. The workers and scientists of Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, through tireless collective effort amid unrelenting pressure, achieved what had been considered impossible only a few years earlier. Yet, at the very same moment, the project exposed our moral fragility when confronted with power that outstrips our wisdom. The force unleashed at Trinity now exists in dual form, as energy that lights homes, a promise of a cleaner future, and as a threat that compels careful global diplomacy. This eternal duality was born from that single flash in the desert. The story is a call to understand that history is never only about dates and famous names. It is about the choices ordinary people make under pressure. The scientists involved, Oppenheimer, Szilard, and many others, spent the rest of their lives in a kind of atonement, fighting to ensure their discovery would be used for progress rather than destruction. They became peace activists, champions of international control, and educators, striving to redirect atomic power from battlefields to laboratories and power plants. Their lives demonstrate that a scientist's responsibility does not end at the laboratory door. It extends into the public and political arenas, demanding that their voices help shape policy. This epilogue places us, the audience and the listeners, in a unique position. We are the inheritors of this atomic reality. The war that drove the Manhattan Project is long over, but the tensions it created among nations still linger. We must ask ourselves, are we wise enough to live with the power we have inherited? Will we use a technology born of secrecy and isolation to build global cooperation, or will we deepen division? At its core, the Manhattan Project is a lesson in responsibility. Those who took part came to understand that they had not merely built hardware. They had ushered in an entirely new era that requires us to be better, more patient, and more accountable as a species. We now possess a terrifying mirror of our own potential. For both engineering marvels and self-annihilation, as we close this story, we do not celebrate technological triumph alone. We honor the human journey of confronting the most challenging discovery in our history. We leave this chapter with one enduring question. Now that we know how fragile the world is and how immense the power we wield, how will we choose to go forward? The responsibility to choose hope over fear, wisdom over recklessness, now rests with us. This story is a summons to remember that knowledge is power, and power always demands accountability. We must keep returning to this history, not to judge the past, but to guide the future, ensuring that the ultimate legacy of the Manhattan Project is enduring peace rather than inevitable peril. If this journey to the Manhattan Project has moved you to reflect on the responsibility of science, an immense turning point the world faced, then we invite you to keep digging deeper. Knowledge is the first step toward wisdom. The moment these seekers live through ultimately calls on all of us to act. Take a moment to consider your own role in keeping this legacy peaceful. Please don't forget to leave your mark. Like this video, share in the comments below the most important lesson you take away from this story, especially about the hope and the fear that accompany every great discovery, and hit the subscribe button. That way, you won't miss the next profound stories about the turning points of history and the human journey on our channel. See you in the next story, where we will continue searching for wisdom amid the great upheavals of the world.